Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And this week I'm with Susi Miller from eLaHub, and we're going to talk about accessibility of e-learning, which isn't something I'd thought about before. I've heard about the WCAG guidelines, and Susi's going to explain more about that because that's kind of about what I know about it. Susi's an expert in this. She's also an author of Designing Accessible E-Learning, so an author in this topic. So you're the right person to talk to. Fantastic. E-learning content, designing accessible e-learning content. Thanks, Susi, for joining. And obviously, I mean, this isn't just for people who are trainers. HR, lots of people will be responsible for delivering a learning. We want to make sure it is as accessible as possible. And I suppose that's where it's a bit of a minefield. I mean, how much of a problem is it in terms of accessibility? I think it's easy to not think about it.
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of statistics around, how many people, how many organisations are kind of considering accessibility. I think probably a lot of them are a bit of out of date now. For example, one that I use quite a lot was from back about 2019, where that was from the World Economic Forum, and they were saying about something like 90% of organisations considered diversity, equity, and inclusion, but only about 4% were really including disability in that. So the disability is kind of one step of the kind of equation of what we're talking about, and then moving on from the disability is what I specialize in, which is accessibility, which is very one kind of specific aspect of looking at disability, which is how you make sure that any digital content is accessible for anybody that has any type of disability or any type of access needs. So really important when you're thinking about people with disabilities to kind of take it beyond what it was traditionally, or is still sometimes seen as, is people who have a visual access need or visual impairment. So people who are blind. Very often people are aware of accessibility when it comes to things like screen reader, users of assistive technology, but of course it involves any type of access need. And so from a vision point of view, that could be someone who has low vision or someone who is colorblind. You also have people, with hearing access needs, with motor access needs, people who aren't able to use a mouse or to interact, with a mobile device using their fingers. And then you have cognitive access needs, which is an area which a lot more people are aware of now, that kind of the neurodiversity kind of agenda is much more well known now. But you also have people with speech access needs as well. So particularly if any type of contact that you're making with people, whether that's virtual, online, or whether it's face to face, it's really important to remember speech access needs as well.
Wow, so a whole host of things that goes way beyond what we traditionally think of as a disability in terms of and so accessibility is the ability to, I guess, engage with technology.
That's how I see it. Yeah, coming back to your what you were talking about, the web content accessibility guidelines or the WCAG guidelines. Those are the kind of, most people are aware of those guidelines, and they are around. They were originally written for web content and mobile apps, but where I come in, my specialization is actually applying them to learning content. So they kind of apply to all digital content, but sometimes, particularly in the past, they've sort of been overlooked a bit when it's come to learning content. But basically, when you're talking about accessibility, that's very often what people mean when they're talking about, how do we make our content accessible to these particular standards? And obviously, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines aren't the only standards for accessibility, but they're kind of the internationally recognized one. And lots of our the legal requirements that we have now they use them as the kind of like the benchmark of what we should be trying to achieve.
So so I understand those because we've got a web application and we have to for tenders and things, we have to be compliant with that. But I have to admit, I've never thought about it in regard to e-learning, and I wonder whether many people haven't thought about it to e-learning. So what would be an example of good or bad, whichever way is the best way around to say, maybe what's an example of bad content, and then let's tell us what good would look like.
I suppose, we do quite a lot of audits at eLaHub, and I think it's very apparent if you, obviously people are coming to us because they need help. So we're not at all imagining that people are going to have learning content that will meet every one of the criteria. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines recently been updated to WCAG 2.2, and that means that there are actually 86 standards altogether. Most organizations are trying to meet WCAG AA level, which includes both A and AA. So that's about 56 standards to meet. So obviously good for us. Looks like people that are meeting, it's very, very difficult to be meeting all the standards, if I'm honest, that when you're doing an audit. But I would say bad content would be that you can tell that maybe somebody doesn't really have any idea of what they're doing, so using their authoring tool but not really understanding how to make that learning content accessible. So coming back to some examples, very often we see things like people who are using interactions that might not be accessible. So for example, drag and drop interactions are very often not accessible if someone has got a motor access need and they're not able to use a mouse, or someone who's got a vision access need is using a screen reader. Obviously, dragging and moving content that you have to be able to see is a classic example of the type of issue that we see, and we can immediately tell maybe that someone isn't so aware. If there is any video content, that's usually a good place to start. For a video content to be accessible, in fact, all learning content to be accessible, you need to be providing an equivalent experience for someone who does have access needs. So for example, if you have someone who has a hearing access need, it's really important that you provide captions, and they need to be synchronized captions so that they're getting as close an experience as possible. You also need to be providing, if there's important visual content in a video, you either need to be providing a transcript, which is describing what is happening in that video, or you need to be providing what we call audio description, which is really a narrator just explaining what is happening. So for me, the videos, if there is video content, that's a great place that I normally start, and I can immediately see if people are aware of accessibility. But you also have things like good color contrast. That's another one that I you can always pick up on that quite quickly. And then also another thing that we see quite a lot is moving content. So people often it's quite common in e-learning to kind of keep trying to get people engaged and kind of maybe doing some kind of moving things. If your learner doesn't have the ability to pause or hide or stop that content, that is one of those Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And that's an important one for me, because that is very, very clearly important for people who have cognitive access needs. So particularly neurodivergent conditions can be very affected by any moving content that they don't have any control over. So that's kind of a summary of some of the things that I will look out for if I'm having a quick look at someone's maybe I'm having a quick nosy on the website and seeing I can see.
That's a total minefield. So straight away, so I'm thinking we've got some minimal e-learning, and some of the authoring platforms, drag and drop, like one of the core things. And I know why you would use it, because you're trying to, as you said, keep people engaged to be able to do things. So are there sort of tricks? Do you do it as because of course what you don't want to do is make everything very, very so so sort of bland that it doesn't engage other learners. Is it about having alternatives, or are there other ways of making things interactive that are more inclusive?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I think some authoring tools, a lot of authoring tools are heading along in the right direction now. It's obviously taken a long time, but so you do have some platforms that actually do have accessible drag and drops. So they actually have made their drag and drops accessible. So it's worth checking with your authoring tool where they are on their accessibility journey. If they aren't accessible, then it's very often it comes back to, I think, good instructional design. I think drag and drops do have a place, but if you're just using a drag and drop for the sake of a drag and drop because you just want someone to be dragging someone on the screen, then I definitely think from an instructional design point of view, there's lots of different ways that you can be testing, or you can be, asking them to be involved in it in a different way. So I think there, and then again, there you can, as you said, your question about alternatives, Lucinda, is really interesting, because some organizations that we work with, maybe particularly if they've got to meet legal requirements, so from quite often in the public sector, maybe that legal, in the US, it's sometimes the federal sector, that legal requirement is slightly stronger. They may have a decision there on their organizations that they simply will not use anything that's not accessible for everybody. Other organizations have a slightly different attitude or approach, and they may think that actually in certain cases, if a drag and drop is a good learner experience for everyone, we can provide an alternative. And that's certainly when we create learning content at eLaHub, that's the approach that we use, just because we're very keen not to go down the road of stripping out everything that is interactive because for the sake of accessibility. And I think that's something, a kind of misconception that we still have in our industry, that often accessible content is not as good as non-accessible content. And I think the work that I've done over the last 5 years, work in my own learning content and in content I've seen that was non-accessible, and we've done auditing on it and it's been remediated, it's so much better learning if learning is accessible for everyone. And that's partly because you think so differently if you are thinking with accessibility in mind, because you're really putting your learners at the center of the learning experience. You're not doing the things. It's very easy if you're an instructional designer, speaking from my own experience, to kind of get stuck in a rut and to do things that you've always done because we've seen it work. But actually, if you're thinking on it from an accessibility point of view, and you're thinking about, okay, I have to make sure that this is a good learning experience for everybody, it really just changes your perspective, and it has a huge impact on improving learning content for everyone, not just for people with disabilities and access needs, but really, I can hand on heart say all the examples I've seen of good accessible learning are just so much better learning.
So yeah, so you're basically saying that it is possible to build inclusive for everybody learning is better all round.
Yeah, so definitely.
On something like, and I suppose they are kind of lazy, but let's say I'm thinking, I won't name the tool, but I'm thinking of a tool, and they have because you've got a choice of things that you can do to make it slightly interactive, and there's one where you've got to match the choices up. So that would be a drag and drop. So, the answer to the question. Now, I don't think that would be count as accessible unless that's an accessible version. So what would you come up with as an alternative to something like that?
So they quite often drag and drops. Well, even if the drag and drop it isn't accessible, you might have a matching drop down. That's quite often an accessible version. So something like that. So it's quite, there's usually, if the drag and drop itself isn't accessible, there is usually, if you can test it yourself, because if you can use a keyboard to operate it, then that is accessible. And generally, if it's keyboard accessible, even if you're not, like we are doing a lot of testing using screen readers ourselves, but even if you're not competent using a screen reader, you can usually tell if an interactivity is accessible. If it's keyboard accessible, it tends to be working with a screen reader as well. But I mean, if you can do screen reader testing, that's brilliant.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because although they're quite, I get what it's trying to do, they're actually quite fiddly even for somebody who hasn't got motor issues.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, and I think that really is a really good point, because we do talk about, when we're talking about accessibility, we do tend to focus on people with permanent access needs. But, it's so important to remember that you need to consider people that have got temporary access needs. We've all had experience of, things that have impacted our ability to work with, interact with digital content. all experienced, the lockdown where you've got environmental impact as well. So, maybe having a slow broadband, for example, and then also that age-related piece, making sure that your content is future-proof is hugely important. So at its heart, accessibility is about making sure that your learning content is accessible for people with disabilities, but also it includes, it makes it so much better and future-proof, and it makes it so much more robust for all of your learners.
And then going back to the WCAG, this is the standard. So you've got, it was WCAG A, there's WCAG AA, and is 2.2 the next evolution of it?
So 2.2, 2.2 is the current evolution. So that came in October last year, and that introduced 9 new standards to the WCAG 2.1. The latest kind of, or the future evolution is kind of known as 3, and it is kind of slightly different. It's it's kind of got broader standards in it. So it includes more of that kind of cognitive access need, which WCAG 2.1, 2.2, all of the WCAG 2s are kind of known to be not so good at. And it also will evaluate them in a slightly different way, but it takes a long time. So I think when I started writing the book, they were talking about it would be ready. I think 3 would be ready in about 2 years. And I think they're looking, I don't know how many years. Even WCAG 2.2 was delayed about I don't know 8 times. So you're talking a good few years before 3 comes in. So I think most accessibility experts are kind of, WCAG 2.2 isn't perfect, but it certainly is, what we've got and what we're working towards, and it can be hugely helpful to make sure that your learning is a really good kind of, as I say, benchmark to be working from.
So following that on from that, then, does that apply to e-learning content? So if I was buying e-learning content, would it have a WCAG rating?
So in the future, hopefully everything will have a WCAG rating on it. I mean, a lot of learning content that you are buying, a lot of people in your organization, I think you were talking before about procurement. If they're kind of, negotiating with people and they're buying, they're in a contract with people, very often that is something that they stipulate in the contract that it needs to be 2.1 or 2.2 AA compliant. If you're buying off the shelf, then you're normally left. I mean, I know some of the content providers will have a filter, for example, that you can filter out, so you can get content that is accessible. But I highly recommend working with whoever is the supplier, and really asking them if they're WCAG 2.2 compliant, 2.2 ideally. But sometimes it's a little bit beyond talking to the salesperson who just will say yes we are, and actually having a look at it. Because very often
you just see titles a lot of the time. I mean, so I've not, there's lots of these places to go, we've got 6,000 courses. And it's just I've no idea I mean, they're from different suppliers, so they're not all going to be the same standard.
No. So I think that's really important to be. And I think from my own experience, suppliers are beginning to understand that actually they need to know about accessibility, and it is at the moment it's still almost so kind of unique that it's almost a unique selling point. People who know about accessibility and can actually say, but I think people people who are buying are beginning to know more about accessibility and are beginning to know the right questions to ask. Like, for example, like I was talking about, do you have captions? Not just is it WCAG 2.2 compliant, because it's very easy for someone to say yes, so I think they're becoming much more aware, and certainly that we're getting a lot of interest from people who are content suppliers, because they understand that actually it's going to be something that's going to be impacting their sales if they don't start looking at accessibility and make sure it's a requirement of their learning. I think when we were talking about statistics earlier, we were saying about that kind of 4%. I think one of the most impactful studies that's been done in the last year, I think it was in last year, by the Boston Consulting Group, they were saying most organizations kind of think they have between 4% and 7% of their workforce has a disability or a health condition. And this study that was done by BCG, that actually covered like 28,000 people across 16 different countries, which is probably for me the kind of most extensive, range of people that have been talked about. And it actually came up that 25% of people that were surveyed in this survey actually said that they had a health condition or a disability that impacted a major life activity. Now, that might not translate into a full 25% of people in your workforce, but it's certainly more than generally even, like the 13% or 15% of the general population who has a disability. And I think once you kind of understand that, the impact, and that's people who are identifying so often people, don't feel comfortable in, disclosing their disability to an organization. So this is, for me, was a really profound how much this actually is impacting. So if accessibility isn't an issue for you, then you really are, and certainly as an instructional designer, I spend such a long time trying to create interactive, engaging, why would I do that? And be knowing that I'm excluding a potential 25% of the people that I'm trying to reach, or whatever statistic you come up with, it's certainly more than, than most people think.
I recorded earlier a podcast episode about neurodiversity, and I think we conclude that the numbers, they say that was 20%, but I think as soon as you start digging into it, the numbers are probably much higher. So all of this inclusivity, well, this is, in fact, that's maybe a good segue into inclusivity, because before we talked about this accessibility, isn't there? And then you in inclusivity, and obviously you want to have both. How would you differentiate?
Yeah, so that's interesting. That's something, again, the more work I've done on this, the more kind of clarity I've had. And this is my, my definition of the two from a learning point of view, from an e-learning point of view. So it's, for me, the definition of accessibility is very much if you're meeting technical standards. So if you're meeting the web content accessibility guidelines, in most cases, as I say, there are other guidelines, then for me, that is what you're looking at. You're saying something is accessible to those technical standards. But so certainly something that we found in the auditing that we're doing, if you're just looking at those accessibility standards, what you're not doing is looking at the learner experience. And so for me, making an inclusive learner experience is slightly different from the kind of just looking at the technical side. An inclusive learner experience, my definition, is learning content that makes everyone feel welcome and included. So for example, you're using inclusive language, you might not be saying click here because not everybody is using a mouse, they're not able to click. You're making sure that the images that you're using are fully diverse. You might have people with some with some disabilities in there, for example. It's just like little things that make everybody feel your language is plain, your instructions are clear, you're consistent, you're not trying to confuse the learner, you're not trying to make it, and that all adds up to being a really positive learning experience for everyone, whether you're using a screen magnifier, or whether you're using a screen reader, or whether you're using anything that's going to help you with your cognitive access needs. So any kind of browser plugin that you might be using, or just any kind of access need that you might have. So coming back to those temporary and situational access needs. So it's a good learner experience for everybody, and that is looking specifically, I say, at learning content. That's how I differentiate between the kind of inclusivity and accessibility. But not everybody would agree with that, and there's certainly an overlap between them. But it's just how I find it clearer to kind of talk about when it comes to the work I do.
I mean, that makes total sense. The one that's blowing my mind slightly is click here. And so she said, so what do you say other than click here?
So you tend to just, and again, if you say click here, it's not like you're not breaking any of the web content. It's just it's more inclusive to say something like select, because it doesn't define exactly how you're doing. And again, people, if you do use click, people who don't click know exactly what you're talking about. But it's just that, as I say, making everyone feel considered and welcomed and included. So just the fact that you've thought about it and you thought, okay, I'm going to use this term, which is a bit more inclusive.
Oh, that's actually really mind-blowing, the enlightening, the things you just don't think about. So that's quite clear. So I suppose, just summarizing, I can see how I can definitely see how it's easy not to do it. I can see there are much better ways of doing it, and I understand that putting that extra thought into making it inclusive is going to help a lot. And if you're going outside to suppliers and you're procuring in your e-learning, then you can put more pressure, or you can choose to get ones that are actually putting statement out there, have done something about it, and showing it. So you can sort of vote with your bank account in that, processes. If you're one of these organizations that are building their own, building your own content because it's internal stuff, I mean, is there, obviously, if you could read your book, and I guess they can come to you for training, are there any top tips that, other than ones we've covered already, that you suggest? And I think certainly you audit, perhaps just to explain a little bit, you audit and you train people, do you, in terms of how to do it, or you do it? What's your...
So I suppose the kind of focus, and again, this has developed over the kind of 5 years that I've been, working in the organization, is that we really focus as much as we can on empowering people to be able to do this themselves. So our approach from an auditing point of view was kind of that came about really. We were, because the training was, been delivering training for for a long time on accessibility and making learning content accessible, but we were getting a lot of feedback from people who were saying, well, they'd been to auditors, and the audit that was coming back, and it was very focused on underlying code, and it was very technical, and it was I mean, I heard someone always stuck in my head, I suppose it was the impetus. Someone said, oh, we had a brutal audit, it was brutal what came back. And the whole purpose for me, and that is quite often, I think, because some of the organizations who are doing auditing are absolutely brilliant, but they're focused on websites and on apps, and that is a different thing completely to doing it for learning content. So if you're just looking at the technical side of things, something that you're looking at very limited at that coding or at that particular technical standard. But from a learning point of view, you need to understand the authoring tools that people are using, because sometimes the limitations is the authoring tool, as we were talking about with drag and drops, and there is nothing that they can do about it. And sometimes the coding that you're talking about, very often coding, I mean, people who have a background in coding can sometimes go in underneath and change the coding, but that's not very normal, it's not very common, and also it risks being, if there's any update, that can risk it breaking, for example. So this idea of it being, for me, it was this, the kind of the idea is that we want to empower people. So the audits that we do are very much, we focus on the issues, but we provide remediation on those issues. And as well as doing the technical side of things, so we look at the WCAG standards, we also will do that inclusivity side of things. So we will give lots of recommendations on things that are beyond the web. And for me, that is making it a better piece of learning for everybody. But the whole purpose of the auditing that we're doing is, as I say, trying to empower people. So it's a good starting point for them to understand the issues that we were talking about. How would you know? These are the issues that we can identify for you. And by providing them remediation and extra support, we then empower them to kind of have a good starting point. And quite often they will go back and come up with a strategy of remediating the other 125 pieces of learning that they have in their library. But we also then combine that with training. So in conjunction with the book, which is a quite useful reference resource, and that's going to have a new edition that's updated to WCAG 2.2 in January. But I've also created an online learning course, which is kind of walking the walk and talking the talk, because it's all very well for me to go, oh, well, I think you should be doing it like this. So the online resource, it's a self-access course, which basically goes through all of those 86 standards using a really common authoring tool, and kind of gives people the step-by-step to how they can really understand and apply these web content accessibility guidelines. So we kind of try and do it in conjunction. We can obviously do just training or just an auditing, but the best results that we've had from organizations, people that have kind of undergone the training, self-access, so you can start it whenever, and then had an example of an audit, so they can really hone down on the things that they're having issues with in their organization with their authoring tool that they're using.
So if they kind of experienced good by doing your training,
hopefully, yes. Without wanting to blow my own trumpet, I mean, we have had some really lovely comments on how helpful it's been, and also that it is good. It's an exemplar really of what you can achieve by trying to make your learning content accessible. And it's also interactive and and engaging. It's not kind of stripped everything out and just give you a PDF document of how to do this.
Yeah, it's not just, and that's the difference basically between just being the brutal audit where you're sort of pass or fail, but you don't necessarily know what to do next, and it's not taking into account learning, whereas this is how you just improve the learning overall.
Definitely. Great summary.
So Susie, if this is something that's relevant to people listening, I think it's interesting to most people listening, actually, and again, enlightening. But there are some people, so if someone listening has got someone in their organisation who's an instructional designer, or you want to review stuff, how would people get hold of you at eLaHub and take advantage of the learning that you do, or to find out more?
So I mean, eLaHub, if you put e-learning, put eLaHub in Google, it will come up with us. So I'm there. My email is susie@elahub.net. Anyone can contact me then. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I think also if people are, this is new to them and they are interested, over the years I've done quite a lot of different webinars. So if you kind of Google Susi Miller e-learning accessibility, there's I don't know how many, but quite a lot of webinars with, when I've got presentations as well, I'm explaining things and giving more detail, and they're just open to everyone. So that's a good place.
We'll put links in the show notes so people can find you direct from there.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much. Again, really interesting.
Very welcome.
I never realised I'd find so interesting, if I'm honest. So thank you.
That's good to know. Not the other way around.
Many thanks.
You're very welcome.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.